Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today I am joined by the disembodied voice of one Berto Burrito. Can want to say hello, Berto?
Nah, I'm just gonna let you sit for a little. Hello, it's Berta.
So,
Um,
yeah, for those who don't know Berto, one of the best players in the game, now has several tournament victories in the past and is now a regular caster for the tournaments moving forward. So, very, very insightful person, especially when it comes to competitive cards. And that is what the topic of this video is going to be. We are going to be discussing what our predictions are for the meta post Brothers in Arms expansion after everything comes out and rotation hits, and which nations are getting affected the most in which directions. So, to start, we will be talking about how each nation fared with everything in consideration, with all of the new cards being added for that nation and all of the cards being taken out through rotation for that nation, and putting them on this list on if they are getting net better or same or getting worse. So, starting off, we have Britain. Berto, how do you feel about Britain with everything being rotated?
well, I feel like they're getting knocked down a peg to S tier. Um, I mean, they have some of the most relevant cards being rotated out with HMS Illustrious, Royal Research, MI5, Seaforth, and the Empire Strikes. Um, and those are some pretty huge hits. But I mean, they're also getting Sincerely Yours, which looks insane. And the Air Landing Brigade, is it?
Yeah,
Or
the Sixth Air
yeah.
Landing Brigade, the one for British elite from the expansion. That's another card that's absolutely cracked. And
So I
yeah, go ahead.
so I think that Britain is certainly here to stay in terms of air, in terms of commandos, in terms of maybe even control, but that one's a little bit dubious with the loss of Seaforth Highlanders being such an important piece of control. That uh, Britain, they get off slightly worse, but you'll still see Britain around, I'm sure.
I would actually absolutely agree with you on that. I think, to be clear, this list is not how good they are relative to each other. This is how good they are post expansion relative to how good they were pre expansion. So I still think Britain going to be one of the best nations in the game. It's going to have some of the most options in terms of versatility of their different decks. Air is definitely going to be around, but I think specifically air is going to be weaker. I don't think air is going to be in a tier above all of the other decks in the game where it's just untouchable and unquestionably the best deck in the game. I think it's going to be a fair tier 1 deck, probably. And with some of the other options they're getting, I think we might actually see more Britain decks in the meta. Not necessarily because of what cards they are getting, but because of what cards are leaving. I think it makes Britain control more viable. And looking at a lot of the British cards, especially things like Green Howard, Sincerely Yours, they're cards that are ludicrously strong. Like, these are S tier cards. It's just Britain is losing, like, S plus tier cards in things like Shelling and Empire Strikes HMS. So yeah, I would agree with Britain at slightly worse. Then we have France. Apparently these are not remotely in order. Um, I mean, France. I'm gonna have to put France at much worse. Um, I think you're going to probably see the same amount of France post expansion as you did pre expansion. As in, I think you're going to see like the same decks, with the exception of Japan France Resistance. It is very, very difficult to imagine that deck existing with Vive with Vive being rotated and Liberation being rotated. So the main hand filler cards are gone, and Liberation specifically being 18 healing you would run in France ally decks. That's a very big loss, especially for decks like Unitless as well. And some of the French cards they got in the expansion, some of them look interesting. I don't think anything is something you would run in an existing French deck, with the exception of Fiery Ambush being potentially runnable in Unitless or potentially runnable in German France Burn. But what do you think about this? Do you agree with much worse?
Um, I would just say worse, just because I feel like Fiery Ambush could be, hmm, well, nah, okay, much worse.
Yeah, yeah. Every time I think about
I
Fiery
just needed a
Ambush
bit to think about
in
it a
in
little more.
Unitless, I think, oh, that's going to be so good. Now I'm like, okay, what do I put in? Because you can, I don't know, some people are even still running Shore Bombardments. You can definitely run a 3-cost deal 3 damage, potentially burn. And then I look and the deck already has 12 slots, and it's like, well, they're losing 2 liberations, but that makes the deck substantially worse.
Hmm.
um, so, yeah, I think unfortunately France has got to be much worse. Then we have Germany. Germany, I would venture to say Germany is much better. Maybe slightly better. I think I could be convinced to go down to slightly better. Um, but looking at what they're losing, they're definitely losing a couple of important cards that have seen a lot of play, like Root Out, like the Befehlswagen, like German Research, of course. Um, except some of the cards they're getting with the new Stuka Elite, Maelstrom, I think, is a very interesting possibility that, of course, 8 credits versus 4 credits is not a direct replacement for Root Out, but you can just build your deck in a slightly different way around Maelstrom, and I don't think that's going to be necessarily even worse than with Root Out. The new MEBF also looks particularly strong. I think Heinz is getting much better in this expansion as a whole, even if losing Befehlswagen. A support column seems very cracked. I think Germany's just getting a lot more options, and I don't think everything it is losing, I think, can easily be replaced. Unlike with Britain, where it can be replaced, but it's much harder. So, what do you think about Germany?
I I would put them at better just because of how influential and how strong Befehlswagen root out the enemy and German research were. Um, I think that yes, they are getting some good tools, but just out of respect for the beef wagon, you gotta you gotta give them a little bit of a hit. You can't sully and disrespect the name of the wagon so hard and not even like give it a mention of how it knocks it down from much better to better, you know?
I, okay. You have convinced me. I'm not gonna lie. Germany is getting a lot more support for sort of mid-range options. And German mid-range decks used to be very, very popular a long time ago and have completely disappeared from the meta. And I think I might just be focusing on that a little too much, looking at the new things you can do with Germany. But yeah, the Germany is losing a lot. And I mean, losing Befehlswagen for Heinz and German ally Jagro is very big. Then we have Italy. So Italy is losing essentially all of the core Alpine cards, um, which doesn't really matter because Alpine was kind of a non factor in the meta. Let's be honest, and it is losing Mare Nostrum, and it's gaining some interesting cards. I think Naval Engagement looks very strong. The other cards probably aren't going to see too much competitive play, but Brute Force has its possibilities. What do you think about this?
I feel like Pasubio is like I'm probably butchering the name, but I feel like that card's like pretty good. I don't think it's enough to like build a Italy minor deck, but like does that card not look pretty good, pretty efficient? Like
The problem I see with it is I think about a deck like Britain Italy control, and it's like, do you want to run Pasubio or do you want to run like, I don't know, Green Howards and East Surreys and Honeys and Draw and whatnot for your healing. And then I look at like German Italy, and it's like, do you want to run Pasubio or do you want to run 989s, the Schützens, the things that can have more immediate impact on the board? And maybe Pasubio, just because it does offer more healing, because with the loss of Mare Nostrum, you are losing like the vast majority of your healing, especially in German Italy. But I don't know. I don't have strong feelings about Vesubio one way or another. Where are you leaning on putting Italy? I'm somewhere between the same and slightly worse. Um,
Really, I was thinking somewhere between worse and much worse. Uh, just because Mary Nostrum is such a heavy hitter of a card, and like the reason why you go Italy Minor for so many years.
that is fair. I mean, I've played a lot of Italy ally control, and I've gone down to two Mare Nostrums a lot of times. And specifically, German Italy is the deck where you need the Mare Nostrums the most. But I think you can get away with not running any Mare Nostrums perfectly fine in like a Soviet Italy or a Britain Italy. Um, I mean, the problem with naval engagement, I think naval engagement is an absolutely cracked card. I think it's insane. The problem is you're going to run that over Decima, and Decima's staying in the game. Um, so it's not necessarily getting a big step up. So yeah, I and also Alpine is just deleted, which is
Worth
like
noting, yeah.
the one other Italian deck. Um,
So let's go worse then.
yeah. Okay, then we have Japan. Japan is getting some absolutely bonkers cards in this expansion. The Shinano, completely cracked. The Matsumoto, very, very strong. It's getting a lot of support for different archetypes. The 24th Cavalry, that can fit into so many decks. Like, I think you could even run that in, like, control decks as just, like, consistent removal for the front line. Because Japan does lack early game in control decks, and I think 24th Cavalry could fit that. Island Defense, stupidly strong card. Um, but it's losing Feint Retreat. And Desperate Measures.
Much worse.
Just much worse. Feint's gone. Moving on. Um, this is so hard to evaluate because the number one and number two played Japan decks are just gone. Like Japan France Resistance is also just gone because Liberation and Vive are both dead. So like the two iconic Japanese decks have just been deleted from the game, except they're getting given so many tools to support a wide variety of decks that were previously just not even remotely playable in the game. And I'm tempted to just go the same. I mean, it's really difficult to tell because it hinges on how good those decks are going to be. Like, maybe Japan Control is just worse than Soviet Control. Maybe Japan Aggro is just worse than, like, Heinz and Frontline. Um, after everything comes out, and people are going to look back at this and say Japan sucks. But maybe we just get into a Japan meta where Japan Control is really good, Japan Aggro is really good, Japan Midrange is really good. I can feel, even though I can't see you, I can feel the the laugh. Yeah, I'm tempted to put the same. How do you feel about
I'm
that?
I'm skeptical about Japan in the expansion. I feel like what they're doing just feels kind of slow and kind of dirtily. Um, and I don't think any of their decks are going to make it to the S tier. Uh, and for that reason, I would put Japan at worse.
All right. I'll go with you. I suppose we should like rank these things. Well, no, it doesn't matter because they're not relative to each other. So yeah, we'll put Japan in slightly worse. Um, Shinano versus Desper Measure, I think is very hard to evaluate which is better.
Yeah, Shinano is cracked. Like that card is obscene, but like the rest of what they're getting, I don't see extreme value in it.
I mean, yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's just is Feigned Retreat as an individual card better or equal to like the 6 or 7 different probably somewhat playable cards that Japan is getting from the new expansion. Um, and honestly, Feigned Retreat is probably better. So then we have Poland. I think this is easily just much better, since Poland isn't losing anything from rotation, um, and it's getting some actually good cards. um, I think Rapid Response is really, really good in certain Japan Legions decks. I think Act on the Intel is a card that you can potentially run one, maybe two of. Just test it out, see if it works. The 3-cost Polish Guard unit that buffs stuff in the support line, I don't know how you use it yet, but that card just on its own is insane. Um, and then, of course, the Yak 9PL. Exile's probably not that good of a deck, but that card is going to make Exile like probably go up a tier from like 4 to 3. Um, so even though I think Poland is still going to be very, very rarely seen and not particularly good, um, I think the cards they are getting do make it just so much better as because you just get more options essentially, and I think several of those options are perfectly playable.
I don't know about so much better in my view, but I agree that the deck is getting better. Sorry, why do I say the deck? I mean just Poland in general.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that makes me want to put it in much better is just since they're not losing anything, we also have to take into account like these cards are just going to exist in the Polish pool in the future as well. Um, so I just this means that we no longer because we're only going to get so many Polish cards per expansion because it is a minor nation. So every time they add like a tool for exile that is playable, or a tool for like this Japan let your opponent, or sorry, Polish let your opponent into the frontline weird mid-range deck. Every time it gets a very good tool, that means that we are slightly closer to that deck making it into the competitive scene in a future expansion, and it doesn't come at the cost of absolutely anything. Um, I mean, Act on the Intel is like the one card that I think is like probably kind of a dud. I think people are going to test it, see it's not that good, and move on. But Rapid Response, depending on the meta, could replace Plan West, which is a thing that I did not think was possible. Uh, so,
Yeah, Act on the Intel. It whenever you look at it, it's just like it costs 6. You know, I think they were just so terrified of the OTK that they like way overcosted it.
um, then uh, let's take a look at US. Um, so cards US is getting in this expansion largely just suck. I'm not gonna lie. Like Pathfinders looks really good, and then almost everything else supports the repair deck, which I don't think is going to be very good. You have ASW Patrol, which will probably see limited play, and there's like the Tomahawks for like if you want to build a Japan US ramp Tomahawk printer deck, which sounds really terrible. Um, so I see it as essentially exclusively gaining Pathfinders, and it is losing U.S. research. It's losing mobilization. 30 seconds is a big hit for mid range. And then it's losing high altitude bombing and war bonds, which are pretty big hits for ramp. I am want to put U.S. in much worse. Like I think frontline is still going to be the best deck in the game. Don't get me wrong, but I think as a whole, the nation is on like its last legs. It is held up by the fact that Sherman is a crazy card and Red Devils hasn't been nerfed yet. But like if a Red Devils nerf happens like next month, is US going to see any play in any deck in any form? I kind of don't think so. Uh,
Well, you're forgetting to include that 3-inch M5 um, actually, as an addition to the pool, makes the US worse.
um, so I'm thinking much worse. Do you want to make an argument for slightly worse, or are we in
um,
agreement here?
I mean, I've always been a 30-second hater. I mean, I hate that card. I have so much trauma related to it. Drawing, I had one game where I drew 4 of them on turn 1 going second. Um,
Yeah, that's true. We don't have to play with 30 seconds anymore. Much better.
And in exchange for it, I get Pathfinders. So like I'm pretty happy. And I feel like Night Bombing, maybe that's a card like you can play in like even mid-range or something. I don't know.
I
Because we've never really seen what direct removal costs in this game. Like what it should be valued at. Like should it actually be valued at 4? Is Blade of the Samurai at 4K like a fair card?
Yeah,
And we just have
that's kind
never
of
been
true.
given access? Or is 5 like where it should be?
I think light bombing's probably terrible. I think there is room for me to be proven wrong about that, but I think it's absolutely atrocious. Um, and also just not even cards US is losing, but also just sort of the decks. I think um, Unitless was like the one other somewhat meta relevant deck, and I think that's going to be much weaker. Um, which is I I just don't really see US moving forward. Like I feel US slipping back into the way it was like 2 years ago, where it was just like the deck that has or the nation that has one deck that's like kind of playable and absolutely nothing else going for it. Um,
I do like the name CBs. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. Yeah, put it where you want.
all
I don't
right.
have strong opinions.
And last but not least, we have Soviets. Soviets are losing first rifles. They are losing Parade. They are losing Ura. And Spyring, Scorched Earth, 845th Rifles, Workers Unite. They are losing a lot of cards that have seen a lot of play. I do feel like Soviets is just a nation that has a lot of redundancies for its control options. Like, it's losing 845th, but that's largely been cut in favor of Bryansk for now. It's losing Scorched Earth, but some decks didn't run any copies of it. There's decks that never ran copies of it. It's losing Spyring, that's similar as Scorched Earth, where some decks just never ran Spyring and was not a card that, created Soviet control. Um, First Rifles is a huge hit. Parade, I think they can get past Parade. Soviets already have so much value, and value is just not really the name of the game right now in the meta anymore. Ura is like the big irreplaceable hit, which is going to essentially greatly limit Soviet combo decks, Soviet aggro decks, Soviet decks like Artie, and self damage. That's a very big hit. And what Soviets getting from this expansion? They're getting Gambit. I think that's going to be a really good control card. They're getting the new Elite Katyusha. That card looks insane. They're getting a lot of very interesting control options. Enemy at the gates, potential Soviet board clear. Astrakhan pincer deck is going to like be made or die on the power of Astrakhan. And then you have a couple of cards which I think are just interesting to check out, like the 4-cost 5/5 veteran that turns into a 5/8, or the 1-cost destroy an infantry and turn it into a tank of the same cost, give it blitz. I think that card actually has a lot of potential as a replacement for like Euro factories kind of thing. So I'm I'm leaning towards the same, but I also know that you are a. I know that you are a self damage enjoyer, and probably have strong opinions about losing Ura.
Well, I'm sad to lose Ura, but like a lot of people didn't run it anyways and had like all right success not running Ura. Like I think it was better to run Ura, but it's not an irreplaceable card. Um, and in terms of the stuff they're getting, I'm just not very impressed. Like I like the BM Katyusha. Um, I don't think Gambit is good enough to really make any waves, although I'm sure you'll find a way to put it into your highlight reel when you pull a Leopold from it to kill it on board. Uh, and enemy at the gates just seems like root out the enemy, but bad. Um, like you're using it like it has to be a board clear, but instead of enemy units losing one attack, they gain two attack. And I don't think your units getting +2 attack in any way makes up for that because you are running it as a board clear. Your opponent is going to get more out of it than you. And if you're not running it out of board clear, then what is this like a 4K blitzkrieg that like
You run it in
it's
the
like
repair deck.
yeah. Uh-huh. So, yeah, I'm just not very impressed with what the Soviets are getting apart from the Katyusha. So I would say that they're getting worse.
All right, I think that's a perfectly reasonable take. I yeah, I am gonna move up Japan to the same just because we have something in every tier now. Um, I think it is hard to argue against losing so many cards which have seen so much play and have been proven to be very good, and getting a lot of cards which are like, it's probably good, it might be good, there's situations. um, and I will just like to highlight Spearhead. I think Spearhead's a cracked card. I don't know how we are going to figure it out, how to use it properly, but like I can guarantee you, like 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 18 months from now, someone is going to use Spearhead in like a tier 1 deck. That card is too cracked to not be good. Um,
Okay.
but that brings us to the end of this section on how we think the nations are being affected. In general, it seems we think nations are almost all getting worse in terms of like their power level, which is probably kind of fine. Like if everything is getting marginally lower in power level, it will encourage more deck building, um, and it will encourage new decks to pop up. Because if I don't know, if rotation didn't really affect anything, everyone would just continue playing the decks that they've been playing up until this point. So now that brings us to the meta predictions tier list. So at this point, we are going to. I've made a list of some of the top decks in the game now, some of the other decks that are defined archetypes in the game now. You'll see on ladder from every now and then, as well as the decks that are being very clearly pushed in this expansion, and we will discuss where we think they are on this tier list of confident tier 1, maybe tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 garbage. Just so we're on the same page, let's quickly talk about what the tiers mean to us. So to be confident, tier 1 is just like, a deck that you're like, this is going to be a deck that sees like tons of tournament play, everybody's bringing it, it's going to be a deck that you're going to be smashing on ladder. Maybe tier 1 is like a somewhere on the line between tier 1 and tier 2, we'll have to see. Meta-dependent decks, kind of. Tier 2 is decks that are perfectly viable in tournament, but you couldn't really hit like top 6 on ladder with. Tier 3 is decks that are kind of getting out there, things you haven't seen a whole lot of or are very untested. Tier 4 is just stuff you would never bring to tournament. But like, you can pull off some crazy stuff with it sometimes. Then garbage is stuff that's just not even worth playing because you'll just lose like 80% of the time. Is that about how you see it?
Sure.
All right. So starting off with a big one, Britain Japan Air. How where do you think Britain with Japan ally Air is going to place after rotation and expansion releases?
I think it's either tier 1 or 2. Um, so I would put it in maybe tier 1. I think a lot of people have forgotten how heavily the meta is built around Brit Japan Air and how it's a bit of a filter for what decks need to have, how fast they need to be, how effectively they can immediately answer things in the early game. Um, and I think once people start trying to play cards like the Polish 1/5 for Brie that gets +1/+1 when you move something to the front line. As soon as people start messing around with that sort of thing, then Brit Japan Air comes back in and uh, starts messing up house against those decks until they fall off a little bit. And when they fall off, Brit Japan Air falls off a little bit. So I feel like it sort of hovers between tier 1 and tier 2
I
based on the meta.
I'm leaning towards putting Brit Japan Air in tier 2 just because I feel like main things Japan brings to the table is the Sonya, it's the Aichis, and those are both just because they're additional bombers you can run in your deck, and they're bombers that you can stick on the board for Empire Strikes. Are you going to run Sonya or Aichi without Empire Strikes? Maybe.
Yeah, like Aichi's freaking bonkers, insane, busted. I don't know. Like
I I'm somewhat
I
skeptical of the power level of Aichi with zero bomber synergy. Air Superiority is an absolutely cracked card and a huge reason to run Japan.
yeah,
Um,
agreed.
and Type 94 is getting a little weaker because you're losing Shelling and potentially Sonya's. If you cut Sonya's, which I think is a very real possibility, since keeping a 1-2 alive is very difficult, and if you're not getting just additional 1 drops to flood the board for an Empire Strikes, you're finding it much harder to use a card like Sonya. Um, but maybe that gives you room to run additional Type 93s, which we've seen in the past, just to get quicker attack buffs, which I think is a pretty good possibility. Because I think Britain, Japan is still very strong for its early aggression and abusing like these high attack bombers early, abusing close air support on like a flooded board very early. And I think they can do that better than any other nation. It's just how good is that going to be? Because without Empire Strikes, if you lose the board, you're very screwed. Um, so yeah, I think maybe tier 1 is probably a good place to put it.
Yeah, I don't hate putting it in tier two either. Um, like I think either of those are acceptable to me.
Then next we have U.S. German Frontline, um, which I would just put up in confident tier 1. Um, this deck I think is barely being touched, and it's going to be probably the deck that everybody targets with their control decks. Like I think unless we see air stick around in a big way, I think control decks are going to move back towards cards like the hammer, um, and like a lot more guards, a lot less like fighters and anti-air tech and stuff. And I think frontline is not going to be like an S tier deck above everything else in the game, and it's not even touchable because there's a lot of ways you can counter US mid range that just people haven't really been doing up until this point in the meta because of air being around. Um, and part of its strength is it's very good against air, which is going to be dropping off in popularity. However, this is just a very proven tier 1 deck that is losing almost to nothing. I think the 30 seconds and patrols are very easily replaceable, and Pathfinders is a very strong addition to the deck. So I'm going to put it in confident tier 1. I don't think it's going to be the best deck in the game, but I'm pretty confident that it's going to remain a tier 1 deck post-expansion. What do you think?
Yeah, I can agree with that.
Then we have a spicy one, Japan-German aggro. So obviously the way we see it, and have seen it for years now, is with Errata and Feigned Retreat. Feigned Retreat is gone, so Japan-German aggro is going to have to rely on other forms of draw, potentially other win conditions. Maybe you go back to the burn version of the deck that existed before Feigned Retreat with air blitzes and Meadows and stuff, especially with Mare Nostrum gone. Burn strategies might become more viable again. Maybe you do Erratos but with Enigmas, and just accept that you have less draw. It's also losing Befelswagen, so the deck's like slightly slower. Maybe you throw in some 24th Cavalries to draw, and I don't know, maybe like 38 Ts. You just run a slightly slower version of the deck. How do you think? So one, where do you think you would put Japan German aggro moving forward after Feigned is gone? And two, how do you think you would build it?
Well, I think that people have sort of forgotten that expansion is like a pretty nuts card. Like 1K draw 2. That's crazy. And it is conditional, but it's on a condition you can control pretty effectively with the fastest deck in the game. Uh, so I think it is a tier 2 deck. Um, I don't think it's something you just grind ladder with anymore. Um, However, I think with so many board clears being rotated out, that you really have a chance to overwhelm certain decks early on without much they can do, even with the loss of Beefwagon.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's kind of hard. Like, it's you're never gonna put a deck that is able to run single regiment cavalry regiments 35Ts lower than tier two. Um, like just the base Jagro stuff that you can do, like the number of times you win on turn 4 or 5 against like an anti-aggro control deck, um, is just stupid, and all of that is staying exactly the same, or almost exactly the same. It has a very steep drop off in consistency. So like if you just have like a slow opener, or like even like you draw 2 cards off expansion and you draw it to like a type 93, a type 94, and you play them both, you deal 3 damage to face with your cavalry, you get like an Akita down or something, and then your opponent just like plays a supply shortage, and now you have 2 cards in hand and an empty board, and your opponent's at like 15 health. And it's those situations where you just play a rat or you play Feign Retreat and you draw through your entire deck. But now you're going to have to rely on top decking a Blitz unit and an expansion, and then that expansion needs to find like 22nd to get consistent draw, and the entire time your opponent's just trying to get something big into the front line if they're a control deck, or get a lot of things into the front line if they're an aggro deck. And yeah, the consistency is, I think, is going to face a big drop off, so I agree with you on tier 2. Then we.
I feel like it's criminal to not at least note each and Shinano crazy card and a really nice addition to the deck.
Yeah. In testing a couple of different Japan aggro decks, it does feel now like if you don't run a Rado, it just feels like sometimes you draw Shinano, or since we haven't had rotation yet, sometimes you draw Desperate Measures, and it's like this card's absolutely cracked, and like this is going to give me a huge advantage now all of a sudden in this particular game. But without the consistency of finding that, it's not like a I have like 2 cards that are like basically guaranteed to draw me it, because it either draws the card or it draws Fade Retreat, which will guarantee drawing you the card. Now it's just like sit around and hope you top deck Shinano, because if you do, you like burn your opponent for 7. Um, but if you don't, then what are you doing? Um, yeah, just some pretty big consistency problems. But yeah, Shinano, cracked card. Um,
And based on my testing, it does have the commando programming where it values face over any other target.
I did play a game against Vinny on ladder yesterday where he had 7 health worth of units on the board on turn 4, and I played a 7 damage Shinano, and it killed his 7 health worth of units that was split across 3 bodies.
Jeez.
It felt scummy. Then we have Soviet Ramp. So this is the Soviet-US ramp deck we've seen popping up in the last couple of months. No one's been was the one who sort of pioneered this version of the deck, but now we've seen it's at a lot of players, especially in the Chinese community, have been copying it. How do you think this deck is going to go? Because it's losing first rifles as the main thing, and now people have been fitting in a couple spy rings. Some people have been testing out like 1, maybe 2 war bonds. The big thing it's losing, though, is mobilization, because the original version of the list, it didn't run Scorched, it didn't run Spy Rings, it ran First Rifles and mobilization as, I believe, the only 2 cards that are being rotated, and probably Parade as well, I guess. How big do you think that is going to be?
Um, I think that it's fairly impactful. And I think the deck started at tier 2. However, the decks, a lot of the decks that are being taken down a peg are things that Soviet Ramp really struggled against, like Brit Air and like Japan German aggro.
That is true. We might be headed back to like a U.S. ally control meta where everyone's just slamming B-17s and Avengers and see who can stick the biggest unit. Um, Not necessarily immediately, but like if aggro fails to take off the ground, we could see players just bringing increasingly heavier and heavier control decks. And Soviet US is a very good option for building the heaviest deck you can. Um, I I would. It is very difficult to evaluate this.
Okay,
Between
think
tier
of it
two and
this
three.
way. Think of it this way, J.K. You sort of define tier 2 around a deck that you would like likely take to a tournament, because it can work to like counter certain things, right?
Yeah,
And we already know that no one is bringing Soviet ramp to tournaments. So by
And
definition, it is
it's
tier
getting
2.
ASW patrol. Um, all
Exactly.
right, I would not bring this to tournament. I don't think this deck is nearly as consistent as other people seem to think it is. And with the loss of Workers Unite, Mobilization, and War Bonds, are you running 5-year plan in this deck? I don't think so. Um,
Uh,
however,
yeah,
uh,
you honestly, you could convince me that it's tier 3.
yeah, actually,
I
having
just
said
thought the
all of
joke
that, it
about
was
no one's
like I guess you have
commitment to the deck was
by
funny.
the sword. I mean, it is one of those decks where like you can rely on top decking because like the average card quality of that deck is kind of insane. Um, but just it's losing so much draw, and like even before it did not have a lot of draw to begin with, and it's like if you didn't hit your mobilizations, you just run out of stuff and you play War Machine every turn and lose. Um, yeah, I'm gonna put it down to tier 3. Like there's buy the sword and there's 5-year plan as like the main draw options now, and I don't think either are particularly consistent. Um, I think that it has room to go back to tier 2, but with the lack of draw, I'm put it down in tier 3. Then we have the other Soviet control deck that has been around for a bit longer than Soviet Ramp. Yeah, in recent months, it is Soviet France control. Where do you think this is going? Because Rima is staying, Call to the Colonies is staying. Those are two very, very big cards in that deck. It's losing Liberation. I never really I have moved away from Liberation in this deck already. Um, Most people have gone down to one copy of Liberation. It is losing Spyring and Scorched Earth, which were very, very popular in that deck, though.
Yeah. Um, I don't know how important spiring is. Like it was so slow that even like control decks were able to outpressure your spiring sometimes. Um, but and Scorched Earth is sort of like the opposite. It's just like so useless against control decks. However, like absolutely game deciding against things like Frontline and Chagro. So it's hard to really say.
My first thought was to put it into tier 1 because like the maybe tier 1 section because my first thought was well, it has Petliakovs, it has Bryansk, because it has engineers, it has just all of the broken Soviet elites, and then you can still run sickles. You can like tech and hammers now to be even better against mid range, and it has a very good matchup into mid range already and into Jagro. It has a pretty fine matchup, and I think it has the strength to compete with German control on value, even without Spyring. Certainly German control can win that if they want to, but that would require building a very, very heavy deck, whereas I think Soviets just has an easier time building a heavy deck that doesn't suck to aggro. Um, so I was like thinking about it. Like, yeah, this seems like a solid tier 1 deck. This is probably going to be like one of the best control decks in the game. And then I thought, what do you do against discard now? Because before against discard, you essentially just like passed a whole bunch and went down spy rings. Um, because the way you win on board with that deck was making huge unkillable boards, and discard just has monsoon rots. And also that deck doesn't have a ton of card draw, and discard just discards your hand. Um, and now that Spyring's gone, you don't really have a great way of generating value. You just have to throw big stuff on the board and hope they can't remove it. Um, and I, I mean, we're gonna get to it in a bit, but I think discard's still probably gonna be around. But having one really bad matchup, um, does that make a deck not tier 1? I'm tempted to leave it in maybe tier 1. What do you think?
Um, man, I know it's a form of bias to remember the bad things that happen, but it feels like every game your opponent would have first rifles on turn 4, and that there were so many of those games that felt like your opponent just loses that game without it. Um, I don't know. That's one of the most bonkers cards in the game, and to lose it is a big hit.
So
I slightly lean more towards tier 2. but maybe I put lean towards tier two and everything, and then you're going to be mad
Yeah,
because
the tier two
the
section is
tier
gonna
list
like
is
be
gonna
off the
look,
screen.
yeah.
um, yeah, I'm just
I
thinking
think
about
maybe tier one is okay as well.
the early versions of the deck. Like the version of this deck that I played a one of the very early versions of this deck in top 32 of Worlds, and I think I ran zero Scorch, maybe like one Scorch, no Spy Ring, something like that. I forget the exact list, but essentially I ran like two Chaikas, three Bryansks. I might even had like an 845th or two in there. Like there is so many early, and obviously 845th's being rotated, but there's so many early game um, anti-aggro tools you can run in Soviets. Like later versions of the build have gone to like everything costs like four or more, and then they have like two Scorched Earths and an Engineers, and they're like, we got this. Um, I feel like poor deck building choices made on behalf of some of the players building and bringing these decks to tournaments does not necessarily mean that the archetype um, is lacking. And I do think you will have to make some pretty big changes to how this deck has been built in the past. But First Rifles, it is the best of the guards, but like three Rebas, three T60s, you're probably still feeling pretty fine. Um,
Yeah, and now you can run 7 copies of From the People in it.
um, then we have Japan, Britain, Air. So we've seen in recent months people realize the strength of Brit Air. Why not take that to other nations? So you can run two Brit Airs in a tournament lineup. With the Japan Britain Air, it had its qualities over Britain Japan Air, such as Rule Disguise is just a very strong card. And it let you run a lot more anti-ground unit cards like Naval Operations and Bonsai to have a much better time at dealing with decks like midrange. Um, and you can more easily run these solid mid-range like 5 cost units like zeros and stuff. However, it also really heavily relied on Empire Strikes, I think more so than the British version, since you don't have cards like Shelling, you don't have HMS Illustrious, you don't have Wellington Monty. Um, where do you think this deck is going to exist post um, rotation and expansion?
Wait, sorry, did you say don't have Monty? Sorry, I was so distracted because I was looking back and seeing that Fiery Ambush is actually a standard, not a limited.
Yeah,
So I meant to say 8 copies of
and 12 if you're
From
running
the
Red
People.
Dawns. Um,
Yeah, and then if you also run Night Witches, then you're up to 15 copies of From the People.
we need to go deeper.
Insane.
Um,
Um,
Yeah, no, I was just comparing Japan Britain to Britain Japan and saying that because of its lack of things like Monty, you're already relying on Empire Strikes a lot more, I feel like, than the British
yeah,
version.
I
Um,
agree.
so with Empire Strikes gone, is Japan Britain even like on the map anymore? Um,
I think tier four. I don't. I wouldn't go as far as to throw it in the dumpster just yet, but
yeah,
it's pretty
because
stinky.
this is specifically Japan Britain. I think Japan Air has its qualities. Like Airsoft is still a very strong card. Real Disguise is still a very strong card. Um, I don't really see what Britain brings to the table other than Empire Strikes and I guess like Lend-Lease and Convoys. I just feel like if you want to build a Japan Air deck, maybe you can build a tier 3 Japan Air deck, but I don't think Britain is probably going to be the nation you do that with. Then we have Britain USA Air, which is an alternative, which I know we haven't really seen this in the meta at all for months and months and months. But I'm bringing this up as an alternative because I think that there is a lot of talk, and I know I've certainly been doing a lot of talk about the future of Brit Air and what the future Brit Air is going to look like. And I am leaning towards Britain US being the preferred ally over Britain Japan post rotation. Um, because you have a bit more stain power on the board. Like you have things like Greyhound. You have the P38 Lightnings, which is just an absolutely cracked card. Plus, you can try to build the deck more mid-rangey by running things like Pioneer, War Machines, and then that lets you more easily run things like Carpet Bombing as like an alternative board clear. Um, so I'm leaning towards Brit US being the way to build air post expansion. What do you think?
Um, I can see it being the way to build air. I don't know if it's more than like the tiniest of improvements over Bridge Japan Air.
I mean, I feel like it just plays in very different ways, so it's probably going to be somewhat meta dependent. Because the Britain Japan Air
Yeah.
is much more aggressive. It's about getting on the board very, very quickly and never losing it. Whereas I feel like the Brit
Yes.
US board, their deck is it plays slower. You trade things out more and slowly build a big board over time. Um,
What I've always said is that I think Brit Japan Air is better against aggro, and Brit US Air is better against control. Uh,
yeah,
and I think that that difference might be even more true now. Um, and it just air superiority. I think that's one of the main ways you can win in the early game when you aren't, just gifted the god hand and going first. Um,
yeah,
so what am I trying to say here? Um, Essentially that Brit Japan Air, when it is able to, fight for the front line like that, and there are no comeback mechanics, that Brit US Air is likely going to get curb stomped by things like US Germany frontline.
yeah, that is true. Um, and I think there's a lot of room to build with it, like especially because you can just run things like War Machine, where like maybe you run War Machine and supply shortage and like you essentially just play like a control deck against frontline, for like the first section of the game because frontline's not necessarily the fastest deck ever, um, but maybe you just want to go like essentially the Japan strategy of like flood the board with greyhounds and gladiators and cast things, and just rely on higher health units to stick around. Um, yeah, uh, where would you put it? I'm leaning. I'm personally I am between confident and maybe tier one because it's like how I picture the deck in my head is very much a maybe tier one. It is very much a maybe. However, I think the odds that a version of Britain USA Air being a like tier one mainstay deck, like even in after like a month or two, because people need to like take some time to figure out exactly what works. I'm like pretty confident on. I'm much more confident on like a deck will eventually, without the introduction of new cards, a Britain US deck will eventually find its way to the top. Um, I just don't exactly know what that looks like right now, so that's why I'm considering maybe tier one. What do you think?
Well, here's what's going to happen. For every single remaining deck, I'm going to say tier 2, and I'm going to let you put it where you want so that the graph looks nicer.
Um,
I don't think confident tier 1 is. I feel like that's dubious. I can accept maybe tier 1 though.
all right. Um, then we have your favorite deck probably, Soviet Japan self damage. And I did specify Japan mostly because we've I've tested with Soviet Britain. The more popular thing to test around with is Soviet Italy, but that's exclusively because of Marian Ostrom, and that's just gone. So I think Soviet Japan is really going to be the only way to build self damage moving forward. Um, where where do you think it is going to go? Because it's losing Ura, um, it's losing first rifles, which is like is
Yeah.
not necessarily like a huge deal. Um, it's
Yeah, it
just
was never the deck that made the most use out of first rifles. First rifles was just so overpowered of a card that you run it anyways.
so things self damage has going for it. Air has been taken down a peg, which is sort of air was very strong against self damage. Frontline is looking like the top dog, which self damage dumpsters frontline, and I don't think that's gonna have changed. Um, Jagro is probably going to be around a lot in various forms. I think the Destruction Jagro that has a pretty decent chance of actually being favored against self damage, just because it has a lot more burn capability. But we'll get to that later, I suppose. The thing I'm worried about with self damage, though, is I'm predicting the meta to slow down a fairly decent amount. especially in tournaments. I think people are going to be testing out a wide range of control decks. And I think self damage can certainly struggle against control decks, especially with losing Ura.
Yeah, so I had a vision last night of the future of cards. I started thinking about, with US Jur frontline at the top, how do things progress? That progresses to people playing self damage, and then it progresses back to people bringing air again, and then we go back into the same rock paper scissors that we had, a few months ago, um, before the self damage nerf. But then I see Noen, an absolute behemoth, walking in with his Soviet USA ramp deck and people playing Monsoonra and supply shortage with limited units. And then I began to weep because maybe Control just wipes the floor with my beloved self damage.
Yeah,
And yeah,
I do see that rock paper scissors of frontline air self damage. Um, I mean, interest Jagro has, at least Fame Retreat Jagro has been removed from that equation. We'll have to see how popular and powerful and how it plays the new whatever new versions of Jagro exist. Except I feel like all three of them are weaker, and Control certainly lost a lot of powerful cards like Root Out, like Seaforth, etc. Scorched Earth is a big one. That I'm just happy I don't have to play around on ladder anymore. But it feels like Control just always has way more options and way more depth in deck building than Aggro does. Because Aggro, you are just running whatever like the most broken cards are, and to get like the slightest edge. And you can't just like swap things in and out because you are running very specific, very broken cards that have like perfect synergy with the rest of your deck. Whereas Control, like I don't know, you lose Root Out, run more like early and mid game anti aggro and throw in Maelstrom. Um, it's probably going to work out to be about the same in the end. So I feel like Control is going to be good. I'm leaning towards self damage at tier 2. Um,
uh, I'm the same. I feel like putting it below tier 2 doesn't really make sense with US Germany being such a probable mainstay in the meta.
yeah, I agree with that. I think maybe if Ura hadn't been nerfed or removed, I could see myself putting it in maybe tier 1. But with Ura gone, I do really think Ura is so much more valuable than counteroffensive. Because counteroffensive, I feel like it, to a certain degree, plays around your opponent, or it is hinges on your opponent being worse at the game. Um, and if everybody goes back to counteroffensive and stays on counteroffensive for a couple of months, people are just going to learn to play around it, and it's just going to get substantially weaker than Ura. And there's a degree of playing around Ura as well, but just the fact that it's able to pull wins just completely out of nowhere with Ura, like Great Patriotic War, Ura, and then like you double attack into something in the front line and hit him for 12. It's incredibly stupid. Yeah, so I think tier 2 is where to put it. Then we get to the decks that the expansion is clearly trying to push. There is the USA Repair deck. I did not put an ally nation with this. I assume it's going to be Soviets, but I did want to leave that open-ended in case you have strong opinions on how to build USA Repair, which I can't imagine you do, but...
Not really. But just looking at the cards, I don't. Uh, I, I'm tempted to be. I think tier 4 probably.
Yeah, I mean, Bushmasters is just like an absolutely cracked card. Um, and like, there's a couple cards in Repair that are just insane, like Medical Battalion and Bushmasters. But just the vast majority of the cards are really, really mediocre. Um, I think maybe there will be a deck in the future where people sort of realize that most of the Repair synergy cards are bait, and they like just run Medical Battalion, Bushmasters, the 4-cost heal everything and draw card, and like maybe like one or two CBs or something, and then everything else is just normal mid-range stuff. But the problem is just how is that ever better than U.S. German frontline? Um, so yeah, tier four. Sorry, USA repair. Um, then we have the pincer deck, Soviet Germany or German Soviet. If you think, I know some people are like convinced that the Britain is the ally to go for with pincer. I remain incredibly skeptical. I think it's German Soviet or Soviet German. Um, this deck has a lot of potential because Ostrakhan plus one cost um, pincer, and the one cost pincers are zero op cost and give ambush. So if you can get like a 5/7 ambush to the front line on turn three, it's going to be pretty good. You also have like the heavy armor pincer, the +1/+1 to snowball even harder pincer. There's just a lot of really okay pincer cards, but it all relies on Astrakhan sticking on the board, and it gets bounced by half track, gets removed by sudden strike. Where do you see? I'm leaning between tier two and three. Um,
I put it in 3. I no explanation. You just
yeah,
deal with it.
I mean, this one I think there's a lot of chance that this moves around. Entirely just based on I think it's very difficult to predict without seeing it in action over a long period of time in several different matchups, just how consistent Pincer is. Um,
I just think it's so slow. And like a lot of the good pincer stuff is on Gree, which means that, if you play your Astrakhan and then you do your turn Gree pincer on it, then yes, you get a good valuable thing, but it's turn Gree and you haven't really done anything to the board, and your opponent's in the front line beating you in the face.
can you run this as a German Soviet and you put in war productions? Because you can run Martyr 20-second, the Pincer draw card, gain a credit, plus like Nakshub. Um, you can add a ton of credit cheat and unit based draw to the deck. So could you run war production to sort of get over that hump of like, because once you have stuff on the board, like especially because of the Jaeger, the things operate for free. The when it attacks and kills something, gain a credit pincer effect. If you can stick stuff on the board, you have a way of generating credits that is going to snowball very quickly. So do you build this with war production? And if so, does that potentially change its tier? Um,
Well, what draw do you get to play with war production though?
you run Martyr, 20-second maybe. You run the Pincer Plane, the MEBF, that draws a card. That's Pincer draw card when this attacks and destroys a unit.
All
Um,
right. So the problem I see with this is all of it, like it seems to rely on being winning or at least even for the deck to sort of function well.
yeah, I mean, I think this is essentially just like, I think it's like Alpine in a lot of ways. Because Alpine is another deck where it's like you just need to go ham out of the gates, and if you have a slow start or your like board is removed by turn four, you basically can't win the game anymore. Um,
Yeah, but I still feel like Alpine was just better at doing that than Pincer.
I
Or
have
will
played
be.
against one Pincer deck, and the game was lost by turn three, and it wasn't even close, and I was on frontline. They got a like huge, they got like a 5/7 heavy armor Astrakhan to the front line on turn three, and the game was just over by that point. Like literally
Did you
nothing I could
win?
do.
Did you win that game if you went first?
Um, I do not recall if I had gone first or not that game. I probably not. Um, it's I don't think so actually. Because I
Okay.
just really didn't really have a way to kill the Ostrakhan in the support line, and like I won that game if I had a half track. Um, but I don't think having it in the front line would have made, or having control of the front line earlier would have necessarily helped a whole lot, because you have to spend credits to get things to the front line, and then they just get immediately annihilated by these huge attack heavy armor guys. Also, if he had had Nakshub, then it would also have just been game over if that were the case as well. I'm I think it will be tier two.
Then put it in there then.
Yeah. I have convinced myself. I think it's a really stupid deck, and I think it's going to be a deck where like the outcome of the game is decided by turn 3. Because that's the other thing. I don't think that the deck needs card draw, because Astrakhan will end the game by turn 6 if you play it on turn 2, and your opponent can't remove it. And I think if your opponent can remove it, then drawing more cards doesn't really matter because you've probably already lost that opportunity. Um, but like, I also think it's not unreasonable to get Astrakhan out of hammer range if you go first. Just for example. Uh, so yeah, I've convinced myself to tier 2. Then we have Japan Soviet Destruction. Um, so obviously there's I know Bubbles has tried building Japan Destruction with like Japan US ramp and Tomahawk printing and stuff. I think that's pretty clearly a garbage deck. Japan Soviet,
All right, buddy.
like,
Yeah, I mean, it's
I said if
like
I
a
would put it
bug bubbles.
like I think he was very clearly playing the deck for memes. I have severe doubts on that deck's ability to not just get to like roll over and die against aggro, or control, or mid range. um, so I think the way Japan Destruction is going to be built is with Soviet ally in the form of either an aggro deck or maybe a mid range deck. Um, how good do you think this is going to be? Because I know both of us have tried this. We have both looked into building this deck. I have previously said that I think it was going to be tier 1. After having played with it for an afternoon, I would like to retract that statement. um,
Yeah, I feel like tier 3. I mean, it it does strike me as the deck that has the potential to have some smart deck builders take a crack at it, make some changes, and bring it up a tier. But I think that if that happens, that it's probably capping out at tier 2.
I would agree with that. The issue with the deck right now is just it lacks tempo. And you can't run war production in that deck, like you could in the Pincer deck, for example. And like everything does have blitz. Virtually everything has blitz. So that's kind of fine. It's just everything also has an op cost. So like
Which
you,
is lame.
yeah, like you're essentially like your opponent moves like a 1-drop to the front line, and then you play like 24th Cavalry and kill it. And it's like you spent 3 credits to your opponent's like 1, maybe 2, and likely by that point in the game you don't have a Matsumoto on the board. So that doesn't even do anything. You have just traded 1 for 1 with your opponent coming out down credits on tempo. So I don't see an immediate way to fix that problem. One would be just run less destruction synergy and just throw in like cavalries and stuff. But then it gets to the question of like, well, at that point, isn't it just better to run Japan Germany? Like maybe there's some room to run Red Dawn in the deck, because I think Island Defense is just an absolutely insane card. Also, Island Defense is maybe something we can take into consideration with self damage. That card is just so ludicrously insane. So yeah, I think I would agree with tier 3 for now. Then we have German Japan Heinz, and we do have a different deck. We have German US Heinz in here as well, so there is a distinction between the two. Because we did see Tiger win the ultimate with a German Japan like a Heinz aggro deck. Where do you see German Japan? Because I think German Japan is just a more aggressive version of German US. Of course, the German US we've seen more recently is Noen's version with like the 4 Panzerrays, 4 Greyhounds, and 3 Blitzkriegs. German US can also be built in a much more mid-range style, whereas German Japan is sort of locked in on the all-in aggro. Where do you see this? Because I already kind of feel like it was tier 3 to begin with. I feel like it's just worse than German US Heinz, and I think German US Heinz is kind of like a tier 2 deck before expansion. And it's largely been untouched. Like, it loses Befehlswagen, which is rather big, because one of the main reasons to run Japan is you can run cavalries to pull Befehlswagens on 1 rather than having to wait for 2.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
even
know.
tier 4. Um,
I could see either of those. I also wouldn't have agreed to be on here if I knew you were gonna bring up the ultimate. You monster.
all right, I'm gonna put it in tier four. I think the things when it works, the things that make it work is it has nothing to do with it being a Japan ally deck. So I think you're just objectively making a mistake if you're bringing a Japan version of this deck. Just bring the US version. Um, so now we have the US version. So obviously the thing to talk about with Heinz is the introduction of Panzer 1B and Momentum. Um, now,
And the loss of Blitzkrieg.
what?
Wait, the loss of Blitzkrieg?
Blitzkrieg isn't being rotated.
How is it not?
No.
When did that enter my mind?
Are
Yeah,
you
no,
thinking
you're
Hoorah?
right, it's not.
Yeah, if they were losing Blitzkrieg, they'd be down in like a garbage tier. That's sort of the main deck, like the deck's main win condition.
Yeah.
Um, now it's it is so weak against frontline. However, it's better than frontline in some of the matchups. Frontline is weak into. Um, I I have never really been a Heinz player. Like I played a lot of Heinz back in like 2019, 2020, in that iteration of the Heinz deck. Since then, I've essentially stayed away from the deck. I don't know much about the current building iterations of the deck or necessarily all of its matchups, so I don't feel super qualified to talk about this. So I'm sure like some dedicated Heinz players might disagree with me on this, but I just to me it has always felt like a weaker version of Frontline, um, or a weaker version of Jagro, depending on how you build it. Panzer 1B I think has a lot of potential, but it's also not a. I don't think it's going to like make it tier one by any means. I think momentum is largely too slow, um, for the deck.
Yeah. And the Panzer 1B is kind of like a bit of a win more card. Like you do need the initiative for it to really do anything.
Yeah,
And in Jagro or frontline matchups or air even, a lot of the time it's just going to be a 1-2 tank, which is pretty trash.
I
So I think air Brie.
I think something that's worth mentioning that we've kind of not mentioned yet is I think we're going to be moving towards Geburg's Pioneer, coming back into a lot of decks, like frontline like Jagro, and even potentially Heinz, like German US Heinz running Geburg's Pioneer again. And that is just I mean, I think we're headed if these decks are all meta and controlled isn't shutting them down, I think we're headed back to a like 75-80% going first win rate, between a lot of these matchups, just because you do snowball so hard and air is the only deck that can, well, sickle I suppose, but there's very few decks that can comfortably kill a turn 1 Geburg's Pioneer, and if you're playing like a frontline based tempo deck with slow ground units, you're just going to lose if your opponent plays turn 1 Geburg's Pioneer going first. Um, and I feel like Heinz is probably able to uh, sort of get an advantage out of turn 1 Geburg's Pioneer more than frontline. However, it also has a much worse time coming back if it goes second. Um, so yeah, I still agree with the tier 3, but I think it is. I think there's room for it to go to tier 2, potentially based on how the meta shakes out, but as somebody who has never really liked Heinz, I'm pretty happy with the tier 3 placement. Then we have USA France Unitless. So this deck is losing Liberation, and it's losing High Altitude Bombing, and it's I think that's it.
It's losing U.S. research.
Oh, of course, U.S. research. That is a very, very big one. Um, I'm curious, where would you put this to begin with? Because I would probably put it at tier 2. I think it's a very solid tournament pick. Maybe down to, like, I think it would be on the lower end of tier 2. Maybe towards tier 3.
Yeah, that's about exactly what I was thinking. I mean, I was thinking like top of tier 3. It's just such a gamble to pick it because there's decks where you just win essentially every time, and there's decks that you lose against essentially every time.
Yeah,
So
still,
it's very
Yeah, top six. The Worlds qualifiers when I had unitless, and it literally zero chance. Like, just from game one, when the only deck unitless could beat went through, it was just like, well, we can play out the next four games, but it's not going to matter because unitless can't beat those decks. And that is a problem with bringing it in a lineup. Is I feel like there's no other deck that is just nearly as close as just completely unwinnable, one way or the other. Now the question is, with the cards it is losing, it is getting fiery ambush, but with the cards it is losing, do you think it drops to tier 4, or do you think it stays at tier 3?
I think it drops to tier 4.
I think I would probably agree with you. I think bringing that to a tournament is going to be very, very risky because I also feel like you're losing out on Liberation and Research. I feel like are two cards that are particularly good in the control matchup, which is already sort of the decks you're targeting. So I don't know. It's not like you're losing like the patrol or actually you're losing patrol. Sorry, you're also losing patrol. Completely blanked on that. That's less impactful, but that is another hit to the deck. So yeah, tier 4. Then we have another France meme deck, German France Burn, which again just is a very, very low on units. It relies almost entirely on burn, but unlike unitless, you don't try to win on fatigue. You try to win as quickly as possible before your opponent can kill you. I would put this in tier 4 before the expansion. After the expansion, what is it losing? What is it gaining?
It's losing root out, which I think is really big. I think that was often like the only way that the deck is able to live long enough to kill your opponent, and it lost that.
I didn't run root out in some of my versions of this deck.
Well,
Granted,
that's why
I
you
think
thought it
that's
was tier
wrong.
4.
I do think it was correct to run root out. I don't think it's unwinnable without root out because scatter tactics is quite strong. And also, yeah, it's. I think it still stayed tier 4. Maybe it's just garbage now, though. Like,
I'm gonna give the hot take
oh,
that
it's
I
also
think
losing. It's losing Kriegsmarine. That is
Oh,
that is brutal.
okay, yeah, you can throw it in the dumpster.
Yeah. You're still gonna be able to pull wins off with that deck, but it is it is so bad. Also, fiery ambush. With losing root out, it makes it actually impossible, virtually impossible to run fiery ambush because it only does the burn damage if the board is empty after you kill the unit. And this deck
Yeah.
has like basically no way to control or remove stuff from the board, so fiery ambush isn't even like an addition to this deck particularly. So yeah, we have gotten our first garbage deck. German France Burn. Throw it in the trash. Then we have Soviet Arty. So I didn't actually write Soviet US Arty. I probably should have, because that is what I intended. But Soviet Arty, it has been a deck that has reached the highest of tiers, and has dropped down to, I would probably say, tier 3, in present day.
And post expansion, I feel like it drops again to tier 4 with losing Ura.
Yeah, losing Ura is huge. It gains the Elite Katyusha, which is just a very powerful card in that deck. However, that is an Elite. It's a one of. It's also losing First Rifles, which was often run in Arty anyways. And it's rough. It is very rough to see this. I don't know if I'd agree with tier 4 necessarily, though. Because I think you already were cutting, like, at least the way I was building Ura, or building Arty, was double Ura, no Patriotic Firestorms. And Ura is, like, way better than Patriotic Firestorm, don't get me wrong. But I feel like Ura is replaceable, and it's worth thinking of what is gone, because Root Out is gone and Desperate Measures is gone. So
Yeah.
it's and like naval operation is gone. Less of a big deal. Shelling is gone. Like the main AOE board clears. And AOE board clears is like the bane of Audi. Because you're just trying to stick a whole bunch of like 1 and 2 health units on the board. I think just the upside of what counters already being rotated could make it sort of counterbalance the fact that it's losing Ura.
Yeah,
I'm kind of interested in trying out it with the new elite and just seeing how it behaves in the new meta. I don't think it's breaking into tier 2 though.
yeah, I hadn't really considered the difference of the other decks with the how much removal was AoE removal was going. And also the inevitability of Jagro not really being there makes Soviet uh, um, a
Also,
lot better in that matchup.
also Mary Nostrum being gone, because that was another thing that really screwed Artie over. Around the time that the nerfs to Artie happened was also like the sort of the rise of Italy ally control, because like often you just like you get a big guy that's healing a bunch, and like Artie has a very limited amount of damage that's able to deal. So with there being significantly less healing in the game as well, I think that's going to help. Then we have Japan Last Rites. So these are decks like Japan Resistance, like Japan France Resistance, like the Japan Soviet deck, where you essentially it's almost a combo deck. Essentially, order heavy decks that rely on Last Rites with Kawanishi or Last Rites as a fatigue blocker to win the game. Because we do have Japan Control as a separate thing. So this is not Japan Legions. Even some Japan Legions run Last Rites. I think that is a pretty different archetype. These are decks that are built around Last Rites. Now, obviously, Resistance is just kind of gone. I think Japan Fans Resistance is like tier 4 or garbage. But, well, Japan Soviet's actually losing Scorched Earth and Naval Operation. Um, it's just like they've gained Under Fire, they've gained Island Defense, which is a huge deal because after the nerf to Long Range Recon, Japan main control really lacked healing. Um, Maybe that's enough to keep it up into tier 4. Um, I do not have high hopes for Last Rites combo decks at the moment. That's not my style of deck. So maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe Gorky and Baron are screaming at me right now, but I I just don't see Japan having the staying power to get to Last Rites. I think Last Rites has gotten better because there's no Mary Nostrum. There's no just like they inevitably heal to like a trillion, and like they have the key Storm Dragon for a second to the last man. Bonsai is going to be pretty good in this meta if air is weaker. So like Japan control tools are really there, but specifically the stall combo style of this deck I think is like essentially nearing on garbage.
Yeah, I feel like it's also worth mentioning Diplomatic Attaché, which I I don't think is a very good card, but it is at least another reason to build a deck around digging to the very bottom in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
which is nice, but I don't see the support really being there.
Yeah, yeah, that is a very good point. And further reason to keep it out of garbage. Then we have Japan Control. So I didn't write down any ally nation for this because I know a lot of people are like really on that Japan-Poland Legions train. I think Japan with other allies is probably going to be better than Legions. I think Legions okay. I just think there's going to be better options for it. I think Japan Control has a lot of potential, but it's also very much unexplored space in a lot of ways. Um, Mostly because just Japan Control hasn't existed, and the Japan Control-esque decks that have existed relied on abusing like resistance, overdraw, forced draw, that nonsense, stall, pin, and then combo. I feel like people have sort of forgotten that Japan does have decent large units that can be used in similar ways as like the Tiger 1E, as the 270 seconds, to just win the game through value. Now, obviously, nothing quite as immediately strong, but like I don't know, you just throw a couple of Osaka regiments and a couple of zeros in a deck, and that's enough heavy stuff to beat, easily beat mid range and potentially out tempo control if you can get enough value out of your big board clears. But you know what ally do you run? and how exactly does it shake out compared to like Soviet control, for example. Um, Discard is probably not like a great matchup. Um, I'm leaning towards tier two. I don't think it's going to be tier two right out of the gates, but I think given like a month or two, people are going to find maybe even several different ways to get a solid Japan control deck that you'd feel comfortable bringing to a tournament.
I don't want to dismiss the idea that Japan Control could get into tier two, but I feel like it's more likely to stay at a tier three, in my view. But we don't have to agree on that. We don't have to change the tier list because of it.
All right.
I'm just a guy. I'm just here.
I feel like the longer this video goes on, like the less serious you take your own views. Um, all right, now we have Soviet tokens. So presumably Soviet U.S. tokens. Tokens actually received a decent amount of support. Not any direct support, but stuff like Ancestral's Call. I'm blanking on the name, but I mentioned it as like a very strong Soviet card. The two costs destroy 3 units, or destroy the unit and adjacent units, give all the other units plus X. Beachhead or something.
Do you think Ancestral Call is like playable? Because I don't.
I don't.
I think that's a piece of garbage.
I
I think
think
it makes the deck worse because people are baited to play it when it's overcosted by 2 credits.
I think there is a world with Ura being gone. I think there is a world where you potentially run one of them. Because like
But
obvious, you could compare it to
I feel like,
Alliance. It does more direct burst damage than Alliance. Um,
yeah, but just compare it to Close Combat instead. That's the name of the card, right?
yeah, the infantry +3 attack this turn. The attack from Ancestral Call is permanent. So my thought
If your
is,
opponent's at 60 health, then it could be better if they're out of removal.
well, like you can do like Ancestral Call to buff a bunch of stuff in the front line. Like, say you have like 3 units, because it's rare you're going to start a turn with 5 units in the front line, and if you do, you're going to win the game no matter what's in your deck. If you have like
So
2 units in the front line, and then like you move 3 up, you play Ancestral Call, so you buff the 2 of them to 5/1s, and then you like kill 2 units in the support line, or maybe like you trade one of them with like a big threat, and the other goes face. Maybe they double hit into a guard, whatever it is. But then you're left with like 3 other 5/1 units that the opponent has to deal with. Now, obviously, one health is not a lot, and like specifically like something like supply shortage, it's going to wreck the deck, like Tora. But a lot of decks don't necessarily have access to that anymore. Like Root Out, German control is certainly lacking easy AOE's. Now, that I still don't think tokens is good. Don't get me wrong. It's somewhere between tier 4 and 3. Before expansion and rotation, definitely tier 4. With air being gone, with air being taken down a bunch, removal being taken down a bunch, with these interesting new tools to try out, I'm tempted to put it up into tier 3 because I think you could probably try to counter some specific lineups that might exist with a tokens deck, and I think you can probably find like decent success with a tokens list on ladder.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say tier 3.
All right.
You could hit top 38 with it if you're committed.
Yeah. Then we have Britain Commandos. So I think the best ally with Commandos, even after rotation, is still Britain German with Reichsbank. Now, obviously, it's getting Sincerely Yours. It's not losing, like, it's losing Shelling. Reichsbank Commando didn't run Shelling to begin with. It's losing Royal Research, which is somewhat of a big deal. But it's not really losing, I guess it still has naval powers, it still has Cup of Teas, all the commandos are still there, Honey, Crusader, Commonwealth. And, yeah, I honestly don't feel like Commandos has changed a whole lot. I also don't think the changes to the meta will necessarily change Commandos' space in the meta a whole lot. I feel like Commandos has largely just sort of remained almost the same in terms of everything in this expansion, which I think would probably be high-end tier 3, maybe low end tier 2, specifically Reichsbank commandos, um, is where I would put it. If you consider like all commandos, probably tier 4, but
Uh,
the power of Reichsbank in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing. Um,
well, so we're considering the deck if it's like played. We're considering these decks if they're played optimally, right?
yeah,
I- I'm. I was actually thinking maybe tier one at the start of this video.
really.
Um, and
It is
that's
getting
because
armaments. Or the escort
uh, well, I wasn't
thing.
thinking about that. I was just thinking about everything else being knocked down. I
Mm.
think it could be the go-to Britain deck. I
That,
think there's a chance of that world
I actually
existing.
that is easily the hottest take in this video so far. Um, and I actually kind of agree with you because I was thinking about like, well, what is it weak to? It's not necessarily weak to any specific decks per se. It's sort of just like an all around deck that's kind of fine into everything. And since so that way it's not really going to matter if like air is less popular, frontline's more popular, or anything like that. But you raise a very good point. Every other deck is getting like at least somewhat weaker overall, and that doesn't necessarily change its power levels related to each other, but Commandos is getting almost untouched. So Commandos is just rising in power level relative to the other decks. Um, and its escort group, I think, that adds armaments or the other one, I forget what they're called.
Materials?
Yeah, materials or armaments to your deck. I think that is the very good chance of seeing play. Because like two order triggers, you put cards into your deck, which is often something you want to do, so you hit fatigue slower. And it gives you additional burn to target face if you're in a control matchup where they're healing and Commonwealth might not be enough, or it gives you additional removal, or in situations where you might not have Crusader, you just like put in a materials into your deck and pray. Um, I think that is going to add to the deck more than Royal Research is taking away from the deck, and that's basically it. So yeah, I actually think I would agree with you. Maybe tier 1 commandos. I did not think that was going to happen, but you have convinced me. Then we have other Soviet control decks. So we talked at the beginning, the two Soviet control decks that have already existed are the Soviet France and the Soviet Ramp. And we've already placed those in maybe tier 1 and tier 3 respectively. But there is a lot of room for Soviet to go in different directions. Other than that, like one would be a Soviet Britain deck. You can potentially run the new draw 2 if you have a guard card, and also just like Soviet Britain has very good like supply shortage is just a very strong card. Soviets have very good units. I think you can build a fairly solid anti-aggro Soviet Britain. You can build a very solid anti-aggro Soviet German. I think Soviet Italy is still going to be perfectly fine since Soviets is not a nation that relied on Mare Nostrum per se, and naval engagement is going to make up for a lot of Soviets' weaker matchups and control mirrors. Um, I I think there's a lot of room for other Soviet control decks. Um, I'm tempted to put maybe tier 1. Um, just because like I think Soviet France is in maybe tier 1, and I think there is a lot of room for decks to be just as good as Soviet France, um, if not even maybe better, with just other control cards, and not even necessarily because of like huge impacts because of the meta, a decent amount because of the meta, because Soviet control has just always been weak to air. Um, but also, I just feel like Soviet control has been for a very long time just kind of untested waters in cards. People just like pick one deck and they're like, Soviet France, it works. Let's exclusively play Soviet France and not try anything else. Um, and I think with everything getting shaken up, I think people might revisit decks that might maybe just even existed before rotation and nobody even looked at. I could definitely be argued to put it down in tier 2, since Soviet France is tested, and other Soviet control decks are not. Um,
Hear me out. Hear me out. Maybe Soviet Italy is the Pasubio deck because You get your guards, you stem the bleeding, you use Vesuvio to heal back up. If they use things like bounce or removal on it because they're an aggro deck and they need to use it, then it's gone for the 7 Falpinis in the later game. You know? Maybe that could
If
maybe
Pos-
that could work.
if Pasubio had 0 operation cost, I would agree with you. Um, like if it was just a unit where it's like, oh, the opponent has to remove it because if not, you get to like heal 4 and hit something in the front line every turn. Um, I think it would be playable, but I don't. You have to spend credits even if it does stick, and maybe. Um,
Spending credits.
yeah, I don't want to spend credits on moving and attacking with things. um,
Fair enough.
so do you
Um,
think tier 1, tier 2, or maybe tier 1 or tier 2?
I would lean towards tier two.
Um,
But if you want to lay
I'm
down your spicy take
yeah,
for all of time to
I,
be remembered as your great
I'm
blunder, then
I
you can.
I'm gonna say it now. I'm putting it in maybe tier 1 because I think there is possibility of a like high tier 1 Soviet control deck, and I don't know what that looks like, so I'm not gonna put it in confident tier 1. Um, but I definitely think there's a lot of room for Soviet control to grow in this expansion, especially with Gambit. Come on, people, we're sleeping on Gambit. Gambit's cracked. The more I talk about it,
Allegedly.
every single time I talk about this card, I say it's better than the last time I talked about that card. Um, then we have Britain Mobilize. This is a deck that didn't really lose much. Like the French cards that got rotated do not touch this. The British cards that got rotated, like they lose research and shelling. Um, but those were never like particularly big things in this deck. Um, I think it's in a similar spot as Commandos, where it's just like a solid Brit list that nobody ever brought to tournaments because why would you not bring air? Um, I don't think it's as good as Commandos though. I've tried to
Yeah.
play this deck, and like I know some people can pull like crazy results with this deck in tournaments and on ladder. I swear every time I play this deck, it's just like I don't drop Hotez, and like if I play out my early mobilized guys, they all die. If I don't play out my early mobilized guys, I never drop Hotez, and I'm just like stuck with a huge hand of garbage. Um,
Yeah. But if we base it on the best mobilized players, it was probably tier three before, and now tier two.
yeah, I think that's a solid tier 2 list. Then we have discard. Britain, German, or German, Britain. Um, whichever we think is best. I think they're probably both playable. I think Britain, German is probably going to maintain slightly better than German, Britain. But you know, discard. These ally combination discard decks. Um, I know some people think the deck's dead. I have heard some people say that the deck's just trash now, because it's lost MI5, it's lost research, it's lost Seaforth, it's lost shelling, like it's lost root out. How does it survive in the early game now? It's just like going to be a deck full of really really slow discard cards that gets rolled over by anything aggressive. Um, However, aggressive things have been scaled back so much, and especially things like Feigned Retreat. Like Jagro beat Discard because you would play Feigned Retreat and then draw through your entire deck. But like if you're just relying on stuff like expansions, 20 seconds drawing, like 24th Cavalry drawing, that is so easy to brick your entire hand even without MI5s. Um, and like for supply shortages, and then like yes, you lose root out, but nobody's running sudden strikes. Just put in like 2 Erados, 2 sudden strikes, and like a green Howards, and you've largely made up for the fact that of what you were losing before. And I don't know, throw in like an extra fortification. Like the deck has so much late game in it already. You can very easily cut some late game to add in a little extra anti aggro if you feel like you now need more anti aggro. I want to put this in tier 1 confident. Um, I don't know. Maybe it's a little ballsy. What do you think?
I'm not confident in many things, and I'm especially not confident in that. I don't know. C4 Highlanders was such a nuts card. Rudo was such a nuts card. I feel like if air is worse, then sudden strike is also worse, even if you're forced to put it into your deck. Um, it does get a little better in the sense that 30 seconds are gone. So you're at least going 1-for-1 on U.S. Germany one drops,
Yeah,
but it's still
I
not great to play it on a um, pretty much anything they play, like a Red Devils or
I saw a
a
wild
Mountain Wolf.
I saw a wild list played by Leo um yesterday actually, where he was testing out. I think he was just testing out new versions of Britain German discard. He was running the Green Howards, which is the new 4-cost 3/6 guard, rather than C4 4/7, but only if you attack. Sorry, only if they attack it. So it's a C4 with -1/-1, and the text on it is draw a card whenever a veteran triggers. But then he was running 2 copies of the Schützen, the 4/5 Blitz German infantry, that veteran if it attacks and kills something. Um, and that actually kind of got me thinking, like maybe not, maybe it's a little much. But I think that cards like Schützen, maybe you can put in like 989s where like you are dealing with these larger threats in the front line, things like Fifth Rangers that would otherwise be somewhat difficult to deal with. So you would just like play Shelling and supply shortage or C4 supply shortage and let them die out slowly. I don't know. I just think the deck has so much stupid power, and they've absolutely gutted the draw engine of essentially every single deck other than Britain. Um, like I feel like almost every other deck in the game is going to be like consistently at like 2 or 3 cards in hand before discard. So like a deck running like 3 case yellows, 2 Wolf Packs, 2 Annihilations, and Fog of War, I think it's just going to be a cracked deck. Like even if you have to cut like all of the late game in favor of like fortifications and honeys and like I don't know, you can run the number 1 commando, like the 1/3 that destroys units that it damages. You can do wild stuff. You can run East Surreys again. I think that this deck is absolutely going. I'm not saying confident tier 1 because I think it's going to be the single best tier 1 deck. I'm saying confident tier 1 because I think this deck will absolutely stay in the tier 1 somewhere. I think it just has too much powerful tools that are very strong against other control decks in particular. Like we were talking about before with like Soviet France, where it's just like it kind of gets bodied by discard, and like Japan control. It's like I can see Japan control contesting frontline, but like kind of gets bodied by discard. So like maybe discard is just like maybe you say screw anti-aggro and you run it as like a hard teched just destroy control thing in a tournament. You could take it in some different directions, but I still see 4 supply shortage and case yellows and wolf packs, and the deck's strong. Then we have Britain control. So these are all Britain control decks that are not, you know, discard. So this could be Britain US ramp, Britain Japan credit denial, Britain Italy like Commonwealth decks. This covers a wide range of decks. And I think I'm leaning towards just tier 2. I think probably the best thing that I can think of right now would be either Brit USA ramp or Britain Japan credit denial. And I think both of those are just kind of fine decks that were probably tier 3 before. Maybe up to tier 2 now, because I just feel like control as a whole is getting like a general buff with cards like Feigned Retreat being gone. What do you think about this?
Um, yeah, it's hard to say. I just keep thinking about losing C4 Firelanders, and I don't. The card's so good, dude.
I mean, I have thought about this a lot too. Britain Control was easily tier 1 before Seaforth Highlanders came out. And all of the cards that made it tier 1 are still in the game, with the exception of Shelling. Like, you still have East Surrey Regiment. East Surrey Regiment was good. And yes, the power level of cards has generally increased since East Surrey Regiment came out. And in particular, it's probably going to get bodied by something like Fifth Rangers. But even then, it still technically trades 1-for-1. But, it's not great. But just, like, East Surrey Regiment just absolutely shuts down other decks. Like, and it actually comes out sooner. And also just supply shortage didn't exist when East Surrey and Britain control was the best, and supply shortage is just so insane. I feel like it makes up for the fact that Seaforth is gone. Just like people realizing the sheer power of running 4 supply shortage in a deck. Um,
Yeah, supply shortage alone is pretty much the reason why I would be skeptical putting it down to tier three. Um, so I think tier two is a spot that makes sense.
all right. Then we have German control. I didn't say German Italy because that relied very heavily on Mary Nostrum. Um, and no one has tested his German U.S. control. Um, Maybe you do German Japan control because of specifically island defense. I'm looking at that card and thinking like that seems like a very solid card to run in like a German control deck as you heal, rather than like running fortification feels kind of mid. Um, and I feel like you can just sort of hold on to that and wait until you drop low and just throw it out. Because healing 10 is so stupidly strong. It is so much health. I played against a game yesterday against a guy who played 3 island defenses against me in Soviet control. And it just hovered over his HQ and just seemed like heals 30 and played mobilization. It's like.
I've hovered over a single Mary Nostrum healing 30 though.
Fair. Yeah, so
um,
I I don't think it's going to be as good as British control decks, and I think it's probably going to be slightly worse than Japan control decks, and definitely worse than Soviet control decks. Um, and because all of those other things are in tier two, that kind of makes me want to put it into tier three. But I also just think like there's so much room for control decks, and just German control is very vague, which is sort of my own fault. But um,
I'm actually really sad that we're losing Takasaki because with the loss of MI5, and people not really tending to run, oh, what's the card called that puts 2 copies of a
Fog
single
of War.
unit onto Fog of War? People not really tending to run Fog of War, like pretty much the entire discard package is now in Germany, which I feel like opens up the space to run the full discard package and Japan with the new heal card. Well, he took out Takasaki, which is a really good card, and another discard, um,
yeah,
good discard.
yeah,
So, yeah. And when I think about if I'm going to run German control, what do I ally it with anyways? I kind of feel like I play the discard package and then I go Britain just because supply shortage is good early game board clear and because fortification is good dealing.
yeah. That is a
And
big
then it's
drawback.
just the German Britain discard deck.
Yeah, that is a big drawback of a German Japan control deck is your AoE is pretty trash, and like Sunstrike and Flampans are very very strong cards, but I don't think you're going to be running Tora Tora. Um, so if you're, I mean, with 30 seconds gone, like actually, how much can you go back to relying more on single target removal? Because I feel like 30 seconds was one of those very important cards, and also Feigned Retreat, just like post Feigned Flooding. I feel like with cards that really forced you to run early removal rather than going 1 for 1 with like sudden strike and then flam panzer and then like a, I don't know, attack with flam panzer, second sudden strike, something like that. Um, Maybe you can go back to 1 for 1 because Germany's very very good at early game 1 for 1 trading. But yeah, um, maybe German control down to tier three. Um,
That's what I was
not
leaning towards
not
as well.
counted because we do have Gerbrit up here. And then last but not least, I know there is some decks we aren't touching, like U.S. Legions, Alpine, the Alpine lull. Um, but the last deck we're going to look at on this tier list is USA Ramp because we have, I mean, we have so many different things, and only 2 of these decks are U.S. We have Frontline and Unitless. So I thought it was fair to include USA Ramp here. It's losing so much. Like it's sure you gained ASW Patrol, but you can't even run that in US main. And this is USA main Ramp. Um, where do you see this going? Because I think US Ramp, especially if we're headed for a more control meta, just a generally slower meta. Also, I feel like just people have been sleeping on U.S. Britain ramp to begin with. You just run supply shortages and fortifications, and then you gain credits into the really big stuff.
Yeah, I just don't really see much of a reason to run USA ramp over Soviet ramp.
I definitely would not be putting it tier 2 or higher. Do you think it's tier 3 or tier 4 though?
I think tier 4.
Well, let's. Yeah, we actually have Soviet ramp in tier 3 already. Um, I mean, I want it to be higher than tier 4. I really do. Deep down, want US to have something other than frontline. But it just really doesn't. And they've lost high altitude bombing and US research, which were like the two main things that like US kind of had to go in for it. And high altitude bombing wasn't even particularly good to begin with. um, like once you like yes, it's US, you can run more ramp. But what are the payoffs you're getting for it? Because mass deployment is trash. B-17F is way too slow. Pershing is trash. Super Fortress is trash. Um, like Seaborne Invasion, okay, you play that to not die because you haven't been interacting with the board yet up until this point. But then you have to rely on other nations, like for carpet bombings or scorched earths, which are gone, or whatever you're going for, or like Germany for a discard package to have an actual win condition. And it just does feel worse than like every single thing. Like, I don't know, if you want to build a US deck that runs War Machines and Hour of Needs, just run it as an ally nation, because the US elites just offer almost nothing for a control package compared to ALF. Really, Japan's kind of there, but like definitely Germany, Soviet, Britain just have so many better control cards. So with that brings us to the end of this tier list. Looking over it now, do you feel happy with what we have made here today?
I don't know if I want my name associated with the Bridger Orcher Brit discard and confident tier 1. But apart from that, I'm pretty happy.
Okay, you put Brit Commandos in maybe tier 1.
Oh, yeah, that's because that next nuts.
Well, I'm just very looking forward to seeing how this plays out, because there's definitely going to be at least one deck out there that either we're sleeping on and we have it down in like tier 3 or 4 and somebody figures out a cracked deck list for it, or maybe like an archetype we haven't even thought of and somebody discovers like the next Artie that comes out of nowhere. And like a lot of this is based on how we think the meta is going to go, because I don't know, maybe the meta is just hyper aggro. And nobody's playing control, and that's going to drastically change this tier list. Or maybe the meta is just like super heavy control, and everyone's playing like US Ally for Avengers and B-17s, and then that is also going to drastically change the tier list. But I would like to just take a look at what we have in tier 1 is 3 different Britain decks. A Soviet control, just as a Soviet control and frontline. And honestly, thinking about what's currently in the game post-rotation and the expansion, that does kind of sound about right. So I think I will leave it there. Thank you very much for joining me on this for this video. Berto, is there anything that you want to say? Anything you want to plug?
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you very much for watching. If you've gotten through what is almost 2 hours now, take a screenshot of this if you want. Reference this, add us in the Discord 3 months from now, and tell us how wrong we were. Especially Berto Burrito, at Berto Burrito in the Cards Discord, or slip into his DMs. And like, share, subscribe, comment, join my Discord, all that stuff. Harass Berto in DMs, and I will end the video there, and we'll see you in the next one.